Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Zag's APUSH from the Underground Garage. Today, we will be targeting westward expansion. This is our first video in period 6, which is 1865 through 1898, and we're going through the first parts of that. So let's begin. Prior to the Civil War, the United States was experiencing a market revolution. New technologies, such as canals and steam travel, allowed and fostered the United States transitioning from a subsistence living and as well as markets and to a more regional-based economy. Just think of the notion that we've said before, Long Island oysters in Buffalo as a result of the Erie Canal and opening up those western territories. The Civil War marked a lull in the market revolution, and the concentration by the government went on for the war between the states. In contrast, Lincoln, being the visionary that he was, still promoted the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad during the war. Once the war ended, America would use the Industrial Revolution 2.0 to help heal and promote a nationalized economy. What we're starting to see here is Hamilton's vision is continuing to grow, that vision of industrialization. The 1890 census showed that the West was closed, meaning that all territory on the continent had been organized and had settlements of Americans. The American vision of the time was that Americans of European descent, for the most part of English and German, the Anglican and the Saxons, as well as being Protestant. At the 1893 exposition in Chicago, Frederick Jackson Turner gave his notable frontier thesis. Historian Alan Brinkley uses Turner's thesis and explains that Turner's thesis was simple: the settlement of the West by white people, the existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement westward was the central story of American history. Moreover, it was the West that defined American culture and, as we call it in APUSH, the American identity. Turner believed that the West was a safety valve of sorts, meaning it kept the nation at peace from political and social outcasts. Political or social outcasts could be ostracized to the West, therefore keeping the vision of the American identity alive. This is very similar. This is not a new notion isolated to the second half of the 19th century. We saw this even dating back to the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were moving west. They were social and political outcasts that were pushed out of England and came to the New World and colonized. So they kept on going west, and we're going to see that same ideology of westward expansion. This notion from Turner would come with its critics, especially after World War II, which would include the narrative of the various minority groups, such as the American Indians, various Chinese immigrants, and other immigrant groups, as well as African Americans. While the scholarship would be altered and tweaked throughout the course of U.S. history, the West gave birth to technologies and business practices that would forever change American history. And I don't mean tweaked in the sense of we're opening up the narrative. That's what we're doing. We're adding on to that American history narrative like we've talked about in the beginning of the year. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about the West. What is going to define the West? The West is going to be defined simply by the railroads. Okay, so we've been pushing west. America has been pushing west since the Pilgrims pushed west out of England to North America. And once these groups, especially the 13 English colonies, started creating establishments, permanent establishments on the eastern seaboards, they would displace those that didn't fit into that narrative. And then they were moved west. And then when an economic resource, whether it was fertile land, whether it was opening markets, whether it was gold or silver that we're going to see in this unit, or really the railroad is steaming west, then we're going to see those groups continually to be pushed. Eventually, we're going to get to that ocean, and that safety valve is going to be closed off, as Turner would argue. But the railroads are going to be the transformative technological advancement in American history that is going to help define our culture, and it's going to be the reasons for the West. It's going to be all the positives, all the negatives. It's going to be the social, the political, and the economic impact to various groups of people. It's really that transformative. It's going to change the way that America does business. It's going to change the way that the United States governs, the way the federal government governs. The railroads were the first industries of this new America, this market revolution 2.0. They're going to, again, change those business practices. There's going to be changes with regulations, with the growth of labor movements. You're going to have a group of people coming together where these large corporations are going to have so many employees that they're going to union together. They're going to create labor unions. You're also going to see questions about the role in the federal government, and should these business practices be legal, or should the federal government regulate? And we see that those answers are going to be undefined in the beginning part of it. And as America grows through American history, as we steam forward through American history, we're going to see the role of government change. And we saw the role of government change after the Civil War. The Civil War proved that the federal government is going to be a much more stronger entity, and that's going to be the case moving forward. And it's not just going to be a political stronger entity. It's going to be involved in economics, and it's going to be involved in social aspects of life, which we've seen with African American groups. So you're going to see the balance, that federalism. Who has the power? Do the states have the power? Do the feds have the power? You see that in various court cases during this time period, such as Munn versus Illinois. The railroad is our defining culture, though. I mean, it is part of not only our political and economic history, it's part of our social history as well, with the movement out west, that kind of John Wayne version of the West, that glorification, that romance aspect of it. But none of this could have been done without the Transcontinental Railroad. We don't become the United States of America that we are today without the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And I'm going to drop in the description a video from CBS Sunday Morning, and it just does an absolutely fantastic job about really laying down and analyzing that photograph that we've seen with the champagne bottles in the middle, the two Victorian-era locomotives pointing at each other at Promontory Point, Utah, where that was the end. That was the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific came in, and that was the moonshot of the time period. Okay, it changes everything. Look at the way the Erie Canal changed the the pre-Civil War America. Okay, we continue to grow. We go from a very subsistence living, very localized, okay, and we grow as a result of the canal boom and that early market revolution where we had factory systems, but they were nestled in, and it was starting to see the blend of the Jeffersonian vision and the Hamiltonian vision kind of morph together, okay? And that's going to lead us into a regional economy. Now, after the Civil War, with the railroad, now you have a way to bring goods and ideas west and back east. And it is an effective way. It is a relatively safe way, and I put that in quotes because nothing in the 19th century is safe when it comes to cross-country travel. But this railroad is truly the moonshot, okay? It's a technological marvel that's going to open up America into this truly industrialized nation, and as well as this national economy. Because think about it. If you're the Union Pacific and you're headquartered in, I don't know, Iowa City, but your locomotive breaks down somewhere in Cheyenne, you can't say like, okay, on the telegraph, we'll be there in 4 or 5 days with the part that we need to fix the locomotive. Okay, you're going to have satellite offices and corporate office. You're going to have your corporate office, but then you're going to have all your satellite offices, just like we do today. We have a corporate office for Home Depot, and then we have all the Home Depot stores that are all linked together. Okay, the internet links all the stores together. The Transcontinental Railroad linked these businesses together. The 19th century version of the internet. Okay, that's how big of a deal this was. But again, we start to see that this railroad, yes, it's bringing about social change, it's bringing about economic change. We're growing as a nation, okay? Because the way that the transcontinental railroad is going to bring us into this nationalized economy, when we talk about the last decade of the 19th century into the early 20th century, this notion of imperialism, when we can't move west anymore, we're going to branch out on the continent. And that's going to bring us into as a global economy. And that global economy is going to eventually bring us into World War I. But then after World War I, we're going to rescind back to that America nationalized economy, really trying to connect with George Washington's farewell address. But then World War II is going to happen. That's going to prove that America cannot sit back. America has to it has to have a strong foreign policy. But again, we're making similarities. We're going for the reasoning point here. We're stretching things out, but really concentrating back on our time period here. It's the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, we saw it with the critics of Turner's thesis, and it's absolutely part of the narrative. Okay, we saw it in the picture. We looked at that picture. You look at that picture of Promontory Point, Utah, and what do you see? You see all white workers. Okay, that's who's pictured in there. But really, a lot of this is done by immigrants. Okay, you have a hodgepodge of sorts of people working on the railroad. Okay, and as the Civil War tore America apart, the railroad brings America back together. Okay, you have veterans of both sides, Confederates and Union, still in their uniforms because they're so poor they don't even have any other clothing. You have freed slaves working here, okay? And you have the Chinese immigrants, which we've talked about. The Chinese immigrants are not going to fit into that American vision, that Anglican Saxon Protestant vision of America, okay? So while they're not displaced, so to speak, like we're going to see with Native Americans in a second, there's going to be legislation that does restrict them, okay? It's going to restrict immigration. And at first, the Chinese immigrants are welcomed because they're the labor force that's doing these jobs where you're more likely to die doing this job, like with the nitroglycerin into blowing through the caves, where you're going literally inches a day through the granite of the Sierra Nevada mountains through California, and they were thought of as being less than human. Okay, so it was okay; they were expendable. You have as the railroad is completed, as even during all these little gold rushes that you're going to have that's going to populate it, there was a lot of Chinese immigrants in the mining industry, which is a major pull factor to the West for whites and for Asian immigrants. And once the gold starts really kind of drying up, so to speak, a lot of white people are going to be a lot of animosity towards the Chinese because of they feel that they're taking their gold. And that's going to be the case even once Chinese immigrants move out of the frontier and into the settled cities, and they develop like Chinatowns and ethnic specific neighborhoods like we saw in San Francisco. But a lot of whites are going to feel that they're undercutting their jobs, that they're working for a much more cheaper wage than whites would be working for, and that's what's going to lead to the animosity. And you're going to have these nativist groups coming about. You're going to see the government taking a role in this with the Chinese Exclusion Act that goes well into the 20th century. It's not repealed to the 1930s, the Chinese Exclusion Act. So we see animosity towards that. We see groups that aren't fitting into this American identity. Another one, for example, is Native American groups. We've talked about them extensively, about as well as the Native American groups that aren't fitting into this vision of America. And what we're seeing here is that America is growing. Whites are coming across the continent, okay? Anglicans are coming across the continent. We're seeing gold fever, okay? We see gold fever happening in the Dakotas, okay? We see it happening in the Black Hills, and during the Grant administration, you have an economic, recession panic after the Civil War. And what better way to stimulate the economy is to have a gold rush, okay? So they promoted the gold rush, and you had all these white settlers coming there. Well, guess what? There was already people living there. Okay, Helen Hunt Jackson, Brinkley would argue in his article that historians such as Patricia Limerick say that this is not a settlement of the West; it's more of a conquering of the West. Okay, that other side of the coin, which again fits the narrative of the time period that it's written in. And that's going to be another big notion of the West, is that historiography dictates the way that historians have written the West and have analyzed the West, and the scholarship really reflects the historical context of the current time period it's being written in. So you have people like Limerick that are writing this in the 1970s, where you see the civil rights movement, okay? You see the American Indian movement. So with these gold rushes that you have going on there, you have these civilizations that are there, most notably the Sioux, and that's where you get Custer's Last Stand, the battle of, what we Americans, especially in the early 20th century, came about as Custer's Last Stand. The Battle of Little Bighorn is really going to be the last stand for Sitting Bull and for the Lakota Sioux and all the other groups that are living in the Midwest. But nothing's going to play the bigger impact on the American Indians in the Midwest and in the Plains tribes than the railroad, okay? Well, the federal government can't afford to build the railroad, so what are they going to do? They're going to offset their payments to these railroad companies by giving them land, okay? Millions and millions of acres of federal land are now going to be ceded to these various groups, these various corporations, these railroad corporations, Union Pacific, Central Pacific. And again, the Transcontinental Railroad, what we have to realize is there's at least three transcontinental railroads crisscrossing the nation by the end of the century, plus the fact that you have all these different spur lines, as well as the sidetracks. Sidetracks, remember we talked about that. Okay, that's, again, another impact of the railroad is in our pop culture and in our own vernacular. But I digress. So we see that the American Indians are not part of the American vision. They're already living in this land that is either being taken as a result for the railroad, for the actual road to go through, or their lands, their ancestral lands are being given away as part of these land dealings between the federal government and these various business practices, business groups, railroad groups. So what are we to do? Well, this is where we get the idea, again, the notion of American paternalism. Okay, so at first we're going to see the reservation system, and we're going to see that we're going to basically round up various Native American groups and put them in these reservations, these lands, and they're promised in treaties and other types, all treaties, with the Indian Bureau and our Indian policy. What we're going to have is that these treaties they're supposed to be supplemented food and water and arable, fertile land to grow things on, and also they're going to be allowed to hunt the buffalo where it exists on this territory. Well, what's the problem with this? One, nobody's committed to this. Okay, the United States government is not committed to giving rations, so to speak, to these American Indians. Secondly, the buffalo have diminished. Okay, the railroad has displaced the buffalo. Free-range shooting of the buffalo and hunting of the buffalo, is not for living standards like the Sioux did. Moreover, it's for the hunt, the thrill, the lure of the West, the glorification of the West is to have that buffalo. We saw Teddy Roosevelt wanted to have a buffalo. Custer wanted to shoot a buffalo. Custer went to shoot a buffalo with his pearl-handled revolver and mistakenly shot his horse in the head, and he was trapped. But that's a story for a different time. So what are they to do? Well, bring in Helen Hunt Jackson and her novel, A Century of Dishonor, where she outlines this. And it's the 1880s. So this is a very progressive novel that brings to light all the injustices by the United States government and calling out the United States government that something needs to be done. What's going to be done? again, the notion of American paternalism is going to start, okay? For you AP World people here, this is the white man's burden, the American version of the white man's burden. And we're going to see this American paternalism with the American Indians. We're going to see this with in the Philippines, and we're going to see it in the 50s and 60s with Vietnam. So Helen Hunt Jackson calls this out. And then by 1887, you're going to have the Dawes Act, 2 years after Helen Hunt Jackson passes away. And she would have absolutely been on board with the Dawes Act. And what the Dawes Act is going to do, it's going to break up the tribal communities. Okay, it's going to break up the reservation system. It's going to break up the tribal communities. They're promised 100, give or take, estimate there, 100 acres of land to farm. Okay, and to create a homestead. What they're trying to do is they feel the people that are advocating for the Dawes Act, these progressives in the U.S. Congress and reformers, like we've seen as part of like the Second Great Awakening prior to the Civil War, that they feel that it's their Christian duty to help these American Indians, and they feel that the only way to help them is by turning them white, okay, so to speak. The ideology of kill the Indian and save the man becomes part of the American Indian policy, where they're going to take children from their home, they're going to put them into re-education schools, American schools. The most notorious one was the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. People like Jim Thorpe, the first American Indian to win a gold medal, and he also played professional football, is a graduate of this school. But they were there to turn the American Indian into a white Anglican Protestant. That's what they wanted to do. We heard that in the Johnny Cash song. So if you want to listen to that again, I'll drop that in a link. I know a lot of you out there really love that song. As well as when we talk about the railroads, I'll drop in the link for Wabash Cannonball. People that weren't in my class, people out across the nation that are watching this right now, across the world probably, definitely check out that song. It's a great song. So the Dawes Act, okay, is really trying to assimilate Native Americans, if they're to bring them into the American vision. Some do, okay. They have an Indian name, but they're being called Billy. So some are part of this, some buy into this ideology, and some refute this. Like we've talked about before, a person like Sitting Bull and his chief warrior, his lieutenant, so to speak, Crazy Horse, are going to refute this. Refute this notion of assimilation, of forced assimilation, of whitewashing American Indians. So that's going to be, again, not part of the vision. So, this is getting a little too long here, so we're gonna cut this up here. We're gonna finish this off. So what we're seeing here is that the West is going to be filled with positives, negatives, social, political, economic impacts. We're seeing the vision of America. We're seeing who's included in the vision of America, who's excluded from the vision of America during this time period. We're also seeing that the railroads are cutting edge. It's cutting edge technology. It's cutting edge business practice, and it's cutting edge for the question of what is the federal government to do, okay, with regards to regulations. So in the next couple days, we're going to see the video coming out on one group that we haven't discussed yet, the farmers. So the populace will be out in the next couple days. And that's about it. Any questions? Shoot me an email. This is Zags APUSH from the Underground Garage. Strive for the 5. We'll catch you guys soon.